At 0 for 30 hours, the first wave of Japanese aircraft began launching into the darkness. Commander Joichi Tomonaga led 108 bombers and fighters toward Midway, their engines creating a thunderous symphony that echoed. Across the water, the pilots were supremely confident, veterans of countless victories who had perfected their deadly craft over Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies. Behind them, deck crews worked frantically to prepare the second wave, arming torpedo bombers for the anticipated encounter with American warships. 200 miles to the northeast, American radar operators on Midway detected the incoming raid. At 05:53 hours, air raid sirens wailed across the atoll as Marine pilots scrambled to intercept the attackers. With their obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats, Major Floyd Parks led 25 fighters into the morning sky, knowing full well that his inexperienced pilots were flying to their deaths against Japan's elite naval aviators. The sacrifice was necessary to buy precious time for the base's defenses to prepare. The aerial battle above Midway unfolded with predictable brutality. Japanese Zeros cut through the American fighter formation like wolves among sheep, their superior performance and pilot skill overwhelming brave but outmatched defenders. Major Parks died in the first minutes of combat, his fighter disintegrating under the guns of Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces. Within 20 minutes, 15 American fighters had been destroyed, their pilots dead or wounded. While Japanese losses remained minimal, Tomonaga's bombers reached Midway at 06:20 hours, diving through scattered clouds to deliver their ordnance with surgical precision. Hangars erupted in balls of orange flame. Fuel dumps sent columns of black smoke towering into the sky, and the runway cratered under the impact of 500-pound bombs. Yet the attack, for all its violence, failed to achieve its primary objective. Marine anti-aircraft gunners dug into positions around the airfield, threw up a devastating wall of flak that claimed several Japanese aircraft, and forced the remainder to fly higher and less accurately than planned. As referenced by military historians at the Imperial War Museums, the Japanese tactical approach at Midway reflected the same overconfidence that had characterized their earlier victories, but this time the enemy was better prepared and more determined than anticipated. When Tomonaga's surviving aircraft returned to their carriers at 0700 hours, the strike leader transmitted a fateful message: there is need for a second attack. The runway damage appeared extensive, but American aircraft were still taking off and landing, proof that Midway's defenses remained functional. Nagumo faced his first critical decision of the day, and the choice he made would echo through history. The admiral ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed for a second strike against Midway, changing their loadout from armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes designed for ship attacks to high-explosive bombs suitable for land targets. This decision, tactically sound under the circumstances, would prove catastrophically mistimed. As Japanese ordnance crews worked frantically to complete the changeover, American search planes finally located the enemy fleet. Lieutenant Howard 80, piloting a lumbering PBY Catalina flying boat, spotted Nagumo's carriers at 0530 hours and transmitted the contact report that every American commander had been waiting for. Enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles. The information flashed through the communication networks of both task forces, setting in motion the sequence of events that would determine the battle's outcome. Aboard the American carriers, still invisible to Japanese reconnaissance flight, crews prepared for the most important mission of their lives. Admiral Spruance ordered an immediate launch, knowing that every minute of delay reduced his chances of catching the enemy carriers. While their flight decks were crowded with refueling aircraft, the race was on. With time as the most precious commodity in a battle where seconds would determine victory or defeat, the irony of the situation was lost on the participants, but would become clear to historians. Japan's meticulous planning had created the very conditions for their destruction. By dividing their objectives between Midway and the American fleet, they had given their enemies the initiative at the crucial moment. The pride that had driven them to attempt both missions simultaneously would soon demand payment in full, measured in burning carriers and the flower of Japanese naval aviation. Sent to the bottom of the Pacific at 07:05 hours on June 4th, Admiral Nagumo received the radio message that would seal his fate and Japan's doom in the Pacific. Lieutenant Amari Tone, flying reconnaissance from the cruiser Tone, transmitted the electrifying words, 10 enemy ships sighted, bearing 010 degrees, distanced 140 miles. The report hit Nagumo's bridge like a thunderbolt, shattering the assumption that American naval forces were safely distant in Pearl Harbor. The trap that Yamamoto had set for his enemies had somehow been turned against the hunters themselves. The veteran admiral faced an impossible decision with minutes to spare before American aircraft would begin arriving over his fleet. Half his strike aircraft were already airborne, returning from the Midway attack with empty fuel tanks and urgent need for immediate recovery. The remainder sat on his flight decks, their weapons being frantically changed from ship-killing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs to high-explosive ordnance for a second strike against the atoll. To launch immediately might doom the returning Midway strike force to watery graves when their fuel ran out, but delay could prove equally fatal. Nagumo chose to recover his aircraft first, a decision that reflected both his humanity as a commander and the tactical doctrine that prioritized preserving experienced aircrews above all else. As Japanese fighters and bombers trapped aboard their carriers, American dive bombers were already winging their way across the empty Pacific, guided by radio beacons, and dead reckoning toward their date with destiny. The race between recovery, rearming, and enemy attack had begun, with the outcome hanging in the balance. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, flying southwest toward the Japanese fleet's last reported position. The veteran pilot had already been airborne for over 2 hours, searching empty ocean while his fuel gauges crept steadily toward empty. Just as he prepared to turn back toward his carrier, a lone Japanese destroyer appeared below, racing northward. At maximum speed, the Arashi was hurrying to rejoin the main fleet after dropping depth charges on an American submarine, and her wake pointed like an arrow toward Nagumo's carriers. At 0:10:20 hours, McCluskey's lookouts spotted the enemy. Fleet spread across the horizon like a vast constellation of steel and death. For carriers steamed in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft in various stages of refueling and rearming. Cruisers and destroyers formed protective screens around the valuable flat-tops, their anti-aircraft guns already swinging skyward as the alarm bells began their frantic tolling. The moment that would decide the Pacific War had finally arrived. The American attack developed with devastating coordination, though more by accident than design. As McCluskey's dive bombers approached from the southwest, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown group struck from the northeast, catching the Japanese fleet in a deadly crossfire. Below them, Japanese combat air patrol fighters were still climbing to intercept torpedo bombers that had attacked moments earlier, leaving the high-altitude approaches temporarily clear. As documented by naval historians, the United States destroyed Japan's first-line carrier strength and most of its best-trained naval pilots. The American victory effectively ended Japan's ability to prosecute an offensive war in the Pacific. The destruction began at 0:10:26 hours, when McCluskey rolled into his dive against the carrier Kaga. The scene that unfolded resembled a vision of industrial hell brought to Earth. American dive bombers plummeted from 14,000 feet, their sirens screaming as they drove through increasingly heavy anti-aircraft fire toward their targets. Japanese carriers, caught with their flight decks loaded with fuel lines, armed aircraft, and stacked ordnance, transformed into floating volcanoes as 1,000-pound bombs detonated among the volatile cargo. Lieutenant Dick Best's bomb struck the Akagi near her island's superstructure, the explosion igniting parked aircraft and setting off secondary fires that quickly spread throughout the ship. The flagship that had led the Pearl Harbor attack became a raging inferno within minutes. Her flight deck buckled and torn, her hangar decks filled with smoke and screaming men. Admiral Nagumo, stunned by the sudden reversal of fortune, was forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser as his proud carrier burned uncontrollably. The war room in Tokyo hummed with the quiet confidence of men who believed they held the Pacific in their grasp. Fleet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto traced his finger across the chart, his weathered face illuminated by the harsh electric light as he outlined the bold stroke that would crush American naval power forever. The date was May 19, 1942, and Japan's most brilliant naval strategist was about to stake the entire war on a single, devastating gamble. Gentlemen, Yamamoto's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Operation Me will be the final blow. We shall draw the American fleet to Midway, destroy their remaining carriers, and force them to negotiate peace on our terms. Round the polished table, the combined fleet's senior officers nodded in agreement. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, studied the invasion plans with the same meticulous attention that had made Pearl Harbor such a stunning success 6 months earlier. The plan was audacious in its scope and complexity. For aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and here you would spearhead the assault, carrying 248 of Japan's finest aircraft and most experienced pilots. Supporting them would be 11 battleships, 22 cruisers, and 65 destroyers, the largest naval force ever assembled in the Pacific. The tiny atoll of Midway, barely 6 miles across, would become the bait that lured Admiral Chester Nimitz's Pacific Fleet to its destruction. As referenced by the National World War II Museum, Japan hoped to defeat the U.S. Pacific Fleet and use Midway as a base to attack Pearl Harbor, securing dominance in the region and then forcing a negotiated peace. This strategic vision drove every decision in those fateful planning sessions, where Japanese confidence soared to dangerous heights. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius behind the Pearl Harbor attack, spread reconnaissance photographs across the table. Midways to small islands, Eastern and Sand, appeared vulnerable and isolated in the vast Pacific emptiness. American defenses seemed minimal: a handful of obsolete aircraft, a small garrison of Marines, and the strategic fuel depot that made the atoll valuable. What the photographs could not reveal, however, was the invisible web of intelligence gathering that had already begun to ensnare the Japanese fleet. The planners worked through the night, refining their timetables and coordinating the movements of their vast armada. Yamamoto's strategy called for a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention northward, while his main force approached Midway from the northwest. The carriers would launch their strike at dawn on June 4th, obliterating the American defenders before the enemy fleet could respond. By sunset, Midway would be in Japanese hands, and the Pacific Fleet would be rushing headlong into a carefully prepared trap. None of these brilliant men, veterans of a dozen victories across the Pacific, could imagine that their meticulous plans were already known to their enemies. In the basement of the Navy Department building in Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts worked with desperate intensity to decode Japanese radio transmissions. The enemy's operational security, so tight during the Pearl Harbor attack, had grown dangerously lax after months of uninterrupted success. As the final details were settled and orders dispatched to fleet commanders across the Pacific, Yamamoto felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and burden that came with high command. He had opposed war with America from the beginning, knowing the industrial giant's capacity for sustained warfare. But now, committed to the path his nation had chosen, he would stake everything on one decisive blow. The man who had warned that Japan could run wild for only 6 months or a year was about to test his own prophecy in the crucible of battle. The seeds of disaster, however, were already sprouting in the overconfidence that permeated every level of Japanese planning. Intelligence estimates consistently underrated American capabilities. Logistics coordinators made dangerously optimistic assumptions about fuel and ammunition requirements, and tactical planners dismissed the possibility of effective enemy resistance. Pride, the fatal flaw of victorious armies throughout history, had begun its insidious work on Japan's finest military minds. 3,000 miles eastward, in the concrete bunkers beneath Pearl Harbor, a different kind of war was being fought with pencils, code books, and tireless determination. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rockford hunched over his desk, in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, surrounded by stacks of intercepted Japanese radio messages that held the key to the enemy's intentions. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his gaunt face as he worked through another sleepless night, racing against time to penetrate the enemy's operational security. The breakthrough had come in late May, when Rochefort's team successfully identified the target designation AF. In multiple Japanese transmissions, the frequency and urgency of these messages suggested a major operation, but the location remained maddeningly unclear. Rochefort suspected AF referred to Midway, but Admiral Nimitz demanded absolute certainty before committing his precious carriers to battle. The Pacific Fleet could not afford another disaster, like the one that had befallen the Asiatic Fleet in the Philippines. Rochefort devised an ingenious trap to confirm his suspicions. On May 20th, he instructed Midway's garrison to broadcast an uncoded message reporting problems with their water distillation plant. Within hours, Japanese radio intercepts reported that AF was experiencing water shortages. The deception worked perfectly, confirming that Operation Me targeted Midway et al. Armed with this intelligence, Nimitz could finally prepare his counterattack. The American response took shape, with methodical precision that contrasted sharply with Japanese overconfidence. Admiral Raymond Spruance would command Task Force 16, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, while Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher led Task Force 17. With the hastily repaired Yorktown, the latter ship had limped into Pearl Harbor after the Battle of the Coral Sea. Her flight deck scarred and her hull plates buckled from bomb damage that should have required months of repair work. Pearl Harbor's shipyard workers performed miracles in 72 hours, welding patches over the worst damage and restoring the Yorktown to fighting condition. The carrier's air group was a patchwork formation, combining survivors from the Coral Sea with replacement pilots fresh from training squadrons. Many had never seen combat, but they would have to suffice. America could not match Japan's numerical superiority, but superior intelligence and desperate determination might level the odds. As the American task forces slipped out of Pearl Harbor, under cover of darkness on May 28th and 29th, Nimitz felt the crushing weight of responsibility. His three carriers represented the backbone of American naval power in the Pacific. Lose them, and the Japanese would have an open path to Hawaii, the Panama Canal, and the American West Coast. The stakes could not be higher, and the margin for error was virtually non-existent. Japanese reconnaissance efforts, meanwhile, suffered from the same overconfidence that plagued their planning. Long-range flying boat patrols from the Marshall Islands failed to detect the American departure, and submarine picket lines were positioned too late and too far south to intercept the enemy task forces. Operation K, an ambitious plan to use submarines to refuel flying boats for reconnaissance over Pearl Harbor, collapsed when American forces occupied the designated refueling point. One by one, the intelligence gaps that might have warned Yamamoto of the trap began to accumulate. The Japanese fleet sorted from its bases in late May, a magnificent procession of steel and destruction that stretched across hundreds of miles of ocean. The four carriers of Nagumo's First Air Fleet led the way, their flight decks crowded with the finest aircraft in the world and pilots whose skill had been proven from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. Behind them came the massive battleships of the main force, including Yamamoto's flagship, the 70,000-ton monster Yamato, whose 18-inch guns could destroy any enemy ship afloat. Yet for all their overwhelming strength, the Japanese fleet carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. Communication procedures had grown sloppy after months of easy victories. Operational security was compromised by unnecessary radio chatter, and tactical flexibility had been sacrificed to rigid adherence to complex plans. Most critically, the assumption of enemy weakness had become so ingrained that alternatives were never seriously considered. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic reversals of fortune, where pride and overconfidence would exact their terrible price in blood and burning steel. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, cloaked the Pacific in deceptive tranquility as two great fleets converged on a collision course that would reshape the war. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood on his flag bridge, watching his flight crews make final preparations for the strike that would obliterate American resistance on Midway. The veteran admiral felt confident, but not complacent. His years of experience had taught him that even the most carefully planned operations could encounter unexpected complications. Meanwhile, aboard the American task force, Admiral Spruance carefully weighed his options as reports arrived of Japanese fleet movements. The enemy was retreating, but powerful surface forces still operated within striking distance of his carriers. The temptation to pursue and destroy was balanced against the risk of losing his precious ships to a night action where Japanese superiority in gunnery and torpedoes might reverse the day's victory. Prudence argued for caution, but aggressive instincts demanded exploitation of American success. Spruance chose the middle course, pursuing the Japanese fleet while maintaining adequate distance to avoid surface engagement. His decision reflected the measured judgment that had made him one of America's finest naval commanders, but it also demonstrated the strategic transformation that Midway had wrought. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American naval forces were operating from a position of strength, able to dictate the terms of engagement rather than merely reacting to enemy initiatives. The final act of the Midway drama played out on June 6th, when American submarines and aircraft located several damaged Japanese ships struggling to reach home waters. The cruiser Mikuma, her superstructure twisted by bomb damage and her hull holed below the waterline, presented an irresistible target for marine dive bombers operating from Midway. The attacks that followed added one more victim to Japan's growing casualty list, though the loss of a single cruiser paled beside the carrier disaster of the previous day. As the surviving Japanese fleet disappeared over the western horizon, leaving oil slicks and debris scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean, the full scope of their defeat became apparent. Japan had gambled everything on a single throw of the dice and lost catastrophically. The pride that had driven them to challenge America's industrial might had exacted its price in blood and steel, leaving the rising sun's military leaders to contemplate a future far different from the one they had envisioned just days before. The Imperial Palace in Tokyo received word of the Midway disaster through carefully sanitized reports that spoke of tactical withdrawals and strategic repositioning, but could not disguise the fundamental truth that Japan had suffered its first major defeat of the Pacific War. Emperor Hirohito, reading between the lines of military euphemisms, understood that the tide of battle had turned decisively against his empire. The man who had reluctantly approved the attack on Pearl Harbor now faced the prospect of a prolonged conflict against an increasingly powerful enemy. Admiral Yamamoto returned to Truk Lagoon a broken man, his health shattered by the stress of defeat and his strategic vision in ruins. The architect of Japan's early victories now spent sleepless nights calculating the mathematical impossibility of victory against American industrial production. His pre-war warning that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year had proved prophetic with brutal accuracy. The 6 months were over, and America's awakening giant was stirring to full fury. The pilot shortage created by Midway's carnage would plague Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the war. Japanese casualties at Midway included aircraft, 248 inches, and personnel, 3,057, representing not just numbers on a casualty report, but the cream of Japanese naval aviation. These irreplaceable veterans had required years to train and could not be replaced by hastily graduated novices, no matter how brave or determined. In Washington, news of the Midway victory electrified a nation that had endured 6 months of unrelieved defeat. President Franklin Roosevelt understood immediately that the strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted permanently in America's favor. The defensive phase of the war was over. The time had come to begin the long march across the Pacific toward the Japanese home islands themselves. The industrial implications of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. American shipyards, already working at capacity to replace losses from Pearl Harbor and the early campaigns, now received unlimited priority for naval construction. the Essex-class carriers, Independence-class light carriers, and hundreds of destroyer escorts that would dominate the Pacific for the next 3 years, were already taking shape in dry docks from Newport News to San Francisco Bay. Japanese planning staffs, meanwhile, confronted the grim reality that their nation lacked the industrial base to replace the Midway, losses while simultaneously defending thousands of miles of conquered territory. The Zero fighters and K torpedo bombers that had spearheaded Japan's early victories were approaching obsolescence, while American factories were producing newer, more capable aircraft in overwhelming numbers. The mathematical equation of industrial warfare strongly favored Japan's enemies. The strategic consequences rippled outward from the Central Pacific to every theater of the global conflict. Operation Watchtower, the American invasion of Guadalcanal, became possible because Japanese naval aviation could no longer contest Allied moves in the South Pacific. The Burma campaign stalled as Japanese reinforcements were diverted to defend the Pacific perimeter. Even in the Atlantic, resources that might have supported German U-boat operations were redirected to face the growing American threat. Admiral Nagumo, the man who had led the first air fleet to glory at Pearl Harbor and destruction at Midway, found himself relegated to training commands and backwater assignments. The Japanese Navy's most experienced carrier commander had lost his nerve along with his ships and would never again hold operational command of major fleet units. His fate symbolized the institutional trauma that afflicted the entire Japanese officer corps after Midway's shocking reversal. The battle's most profound impact, however, lay in the realm of national psychology and strategic thinking. Japanese military culture, built on concepts of spiritual superiority and divine protection, struggled to comprehend a defeat so complete and unexpected. The invincibility complex that had driven expansion across the Pacific gave way to defensive thinking and increasingly desperate measures as the war progressed. For America, Midway marked the transition from victim to victor, from defensive reaction to offensive initiative. The nation that had reeled from Pearl Harbor's surprise attack now possessed the confidence and capability to carry the war to Japan's doorstep. Admiral Nimitz's Pacific Fleet would grow from 3 precious carriers to over 100 by war's end, each one a floating testament to American industrial supremacy and the lessons learned in the crucible of combat. As the burned-out hulks up for Japanese carriers settled into the Pacific depths, taking with them the dreams of empire and the elite pilots who had terrorized Allied forces across half the world, the ultimate lesson of Midway became clear. Pride, the fatal flaw that had driven Japan to challenge America's industrial might, had exacted its payment in full. The Rising Sun's military planners had gambled everything on a single decisive battle and lost not just ships and planes, but the initiative that would never again be theirs to grasp. Their vision had indeed turned to ash, scattered on Pacific winds that now carried the promise of American victory and Japanese defeat. The Kaga died even more spectacularly, taking for direct hits that turned her into a blazing wreck. Her aviation gasoline ignited in a series of tremendous explosions that could be seen from 50 miles away, the mushroom clouds of fire and debris climbing thousands of feet into the tropical sky. The Soryu followed moments later, victim of 3 bombs that penetrated her flight deck and detonated among the armed aircraft below. In less than 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's fleet carriers had been transformed from instruments of conquest into floating funeral pyres. The pride that had driven Japan to Pearl Harbor and across the Pacific had exacted its price in the most brutal fashion imaginable. The pilots, who had terrorized Allied forces from Hawaii to Ceylon, now found themselves swimming in oil-covered water, watching their carriers sink beneath the waves. The vision of Japanese dominance in the Pacific was literally turning to ash before their eyes, and the war they thought they were winning had suddenly, irrevocably, turned against them. The smoke rising from 3 burning Japanese carriers painted the afternoon sky in shades of black and orange, but Admiral Hiryu's captain, Tamon Yamaguchi, was not ready to concede defeat. The sole surviving flat-top of Nagumo's once mighty force still possessed 24 aircraft and some of Japan's finest pilots. enough firepower to exact a terrible vengeance on the American fleet. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Yamaguchi launched his counterstrike, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters racing eastward. Under Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi's determined leadership, the Japanese pilots flew with the desperate courage of samurai, facing their final battle, knowing that their carriers and comrades were burning behind them while their homeland's fate hung in the balance. They had trained for this moment their entire military careers, perfecting techniques that had proven devastatingly effective from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon. Now they would discover whether skill and determination could overcome the odds that had suddenly turned so decisively against the rising sun. Aboard the Yorktown, radar operators detected the incoming strike at 55 miles, giving Admiral Fletcher precious minutes to prepare his defenses. The carrier had already survived one major battle at Coral Sea, and her crew worked with the methodical efficiency of veterans as fighters scrambled to intercept, and damage control parties stood ready, the patches covering bomb holes from her previous encounter were clearly visible on her flight deck, testament to both American industrial resilience and the growing intensity of Pacific combat. The aerial battle that erupted over Task Force 17 showcased the lethal skills that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary. Kobayashi's dive bombers fought their way through American fighter defenses and anti-aircraft fire with suicidal determination, pressing their attacks despite mounting losses. At 1:14 hours, 3 bombs struck the Yorktown in rapid succession, the explosions penetrating her flight deck and igniting fires in her aircraft storage areas. For a brief moment, it appeared that Japanese technical superiority and pilot training might still snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. The Yorktown listed heavily to port as damage control parties fought to contain the flooding and extinguish the spreading fires. Her boilers went offline, leaving the great ship dead in the water and apparently doomed. Radio transmissions crackled, with reports of a sinking American carrier, raising hopes throughout the remaining Japanese fleet that their counterattack had succeeded. But American damage control techniques, developed through hard experience and superior training, proved equal to the challenge. Chief Warrant Officer John Greenbacker led repair parties into smoke-filled compartments, shoring up bulkheads and counter-flooding to correct the carrier's list. Within 2 hours, the Yorktown was back in action, her flight deck operational and her machinery restored to fighting condition. The ship that Japanese pilots reported as sinking had risen like phoenix from her own ashes. The Hiryu launched a second strike at 2:30 hours, this time sending torpedo bombers to finish what the dive bombers had started. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, wounded in the morning attack on Midway, led 10 torpedo planes in what everyone knew would be a one-way mission. His aircraft carried barely enough fuel to reach the American fleet, leaving no possibility of return to their burning carrier. The attack epitomized the Japanese warrior ethos: death before dishonor, victory at any cost. As noted in historical accounts from the National World War II Museum, the Japanese lost over 100 trained pilots who could not be replaced. In a larger, strategic sense, the Japanese offensive in the Pacific was derailed. This loss of irreplaceable aircrew would prove even more devastating than the destruction of the carriers themselves. Tomonaga's torpedo planes pressed home their attack with magnificent courage, flying through a wall of anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky into a deadly constellation of flak bursts and tracer rounds. 2 torpedoes found their mark, striking the Yorktown's port side and opening massive holes in her hull. This time the damage proved fatal, and Admiral Fletcher ordered the carrier abandoned as she settled deeper into the Pacific swells. Yet even as Japanese pilots celebrated their apparent victory, American dive bombers were already airborne and heading for the Hiryu. At 5:05 hours, 24 Dauntlesses from the Enterprise found the last enemy carrier and dove to attack through the gathering dusk. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led the assault, his 1,000-pound bomb striking near the Hiryu's forward elevator and setting off the same catastrophic chain reaction that had doomed her sister ships. Within hours, all 4 carriers of the First Air Fleet were burning wrecks scattered across hundreds of square miles of Pacific Ocean. The elite pilots who had begun the day confident of crushing American naval power, now floated in life rafts, watching their dreams of empire sink beneath the waves. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship, standing at attention on the Hiryu's bridge, as flames consumed the last symbol of Japanese naval supremacy. The pride that had driven them to challenge America's industrial might had extracted its final terrible payment in the cold waters northwest of Midway atoll. As darkness fell on June 4th, 1942, Admiral Yamamoto stood on the bridge of his flagship Yamato, staring into the Pacific night while radio reports brought news of an unimaginable catastrophe. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned his government about America's potential for industrial warfare, now faced the collapse of everything he had worked to achieve. For fleet carriers destroyed, over 3,000 men dead or missing, and Japan's carefully hoarded reserves of trained pilots scattered like leaves in a typhoon. The magnitude of the disaster slowly revealed itself through fragmentary radio transmissions from surviving ships and rescue aircraft. The Akagi, his former flagship and symbol of Japanese naval power, had finally succumbed to her wounds and slipped beneath the waves after burning for 9 hours. The Kaga had exploded with such violence that witnesses reported seeing pieces of aircraft and human bodies hurled hundreds of feet into the air. The Soryu and Hiryu followed their sisters to the bottom, taking with them not just thousands of tons of irreplaceable steel, but the accumulated experience of Japan's most skilled aviation units. Yamamoto's staff officers urged him to press forward with the battleship engagement that had always been the operation's ultimate objective. The main force still possessed overwhelming firepower, including the Yamato's 18-inch guns and 9 other battleships that could pulverize any American surface force. But the admiral understood what his subordinates could not yet grasp. Without air cover, his magnificent battleships were simply expensive targets for enemy aircraft. The era of the gun-armed dreadnought had died with his carriers, though pride and tradition made the lesson difficult to accept. At 0 to 55 hours on June 5th, Yamamoto transmitted the order that acknowledged Japan's first major defeat. Occupation of Midway is cancelled. The simple message carried enormous implications, marking not just the failure of Operation May, but the end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific. Without the carriers and trained pilots lost at Midway, future operations would have to be defensive in nature, trading space for time while America's industrial machine geared up for total war. The psychological impact on Japanese planning proved even more devastating than the material losses. Officers who had grown accustomed to easy victories suddenly found themselves questioning fundamental assumptions about American fighting ability and Japanese invincibility. The myth of divine protection that had sustained the empire through its early conquests lay shattered like the flight decks of Nagumo's carriers, replaced by the sobering realization that this war might not end in negotiated peace, but total defeat. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, the pilot who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and who had been hospitalized with appendicitis during the Midway operation, later described the mood aboard the surviving ships as they limped back toward Japan. Veterans who had never known defeat struggled to comprehend how their technical superiority and tactical excellence had proved insufficient against an enemy they had underestimated. The confidence that had carried them across the Pacific in 6 months of conquest had evaporated like morning mist.